Congress, usually, especially on the House side, has usually been, or traditionally been, a byproduct of committees. So the committee assignment was actually the first thing you have to fight for, and it's extremely important. Have to admit, in the last year and a half, the importance of committees has been downgraded significantly because much of the legislation has been written outside of the committee process. But that's one of the things that whatever happens, I think whoever gets control of Congress in this next election, one of the things they have all said they want to do is to try and reemphasize the role of committees. So just so that you know, the three committees upon which I serve, which will then take up the bulk of my time, will be the Armed Services Committee, which for this district is extremely important. There are 8 military installations in the state of Utah. 7 of those 8 are actually in the 1st district. So that becomes a significant one. Second deals with Resource Committee. Resources is 60% of the state of Utah, actually close to 70% of the state of Utah is owned by the federal government. And a lot of the problems you have, especially when it comes to funding of education in the state of Utah, is going to be determined on what we do to develop the resources with the state, the majority of which are actually controlled by the federal government. That becomes significant. Right now I am the ranking member on the Public Lands Subcommittee. If the Republicans were to take charge, no one really knows what would happen, but there was a good chance I would be the chairman of that particular subcommittee. The third area I'm into is actually Education Committee. I really enjoy Armed Services and Resources. And if someone cares, Armed Services is a perfect example of how bipartisanship can work. The Education Committee is a perfect example of how bipartisanship never works. It's a sad committee. The other two things that occupy my time, which have become extremely important to me, I was elected by my peers to be the chairman of the Western Caucus. So all Western issues become extremely significant, and it's actually the second largest caucus that happens to be in Congress right now, and even though it's the Western Caucus, we've expanded the membership, so I actually have a lot of people from other parts of the country. A lot of Texans have joined it. I've got Georgians that are in there, even a guy from Pennsylvania that's part of the Western Caucus. We have similar issues on a lot of things, not just specifically land issues. And the final one is I'm also the chairman of the task force on the 10th Amendment. So if indeed any of you want to wax philosophical about what the role of government ought to be, to me the 10th Amendment is extremely significant. The concept of federalism as a solution to the problems that we have is extremely important. And as I go back there in this next session, my goal is to introduce a series of bills, not just by me, but as the task force itself, to try to empower states and present a concept of balance. It's not the same thing as states' rights. So as you start talking about that, realize states' rights is a language that deals with power and control. Founding Fathers decided to ensure individual liberty, which to me means that people have choices and options granted to them. They had to have some kind of balance horizontally between the 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, which usually in high school that's all they talk about. But equally important to them was a vertical balance between the national government and states. The concept of that balance was so no one entity had too much power. If the states controlled the national government, your individual liberties could be put at jeopardy. If the national government controls the states, it's the same concept that's there. So reestablishing that balance by devolving programs back to states so states can make their decisions and empowering states so they have a better chance of providing some kind of balance between those two elements is going to be a significant issue that I'm going to look forward to in the future. If you deal in the armed services area, I do have to admit, let's face it, Utah is really an Air Force state. Hill Air Force Base is one of those things that drives it along with the Utah Test and Training Range that's out there. That becomes a significant focus. So things like the F-35 and the F-22 are extremely significant to me. If you're dealing also with public lands, because that is my position, actually border security has now fallen to the purview of where I am, and I am very passionate on that particular issue of border security, which has to be the first step that one considers before there is any kind of immigration reform whatsoever. Any kind of comprehensive immigration reform will fail if you haven't taken the first step of actually making sure there is border security. And I have a thesis that the biggest problem with border security is not necessarily the Border Patrol. They do their jobs well when they are allowed to. but there are specific federal laws that are prohibiting the Border Patrol from actually controlling the border. So with that, just as an introduction, let me once again thank you for being here. Utah State is important because I like dark blue a whole lot better than light blue. A whole lot better than light blue. And I also had all of my kids went to school here. So I have dropped a whole lot of money into this campus and in various types of apartments, some better than others, for my kids. So, do you actually have a question or somewhere where you'd like me to direct you for the few minutes that we're going to be here together? Or have you just eaten the pizza and you're ready to go back now?
I have one. I think this is pertinent to students. Since Bob Bennett will not be returning to the Senate, he directed a lot of earmarks to our university that we will be missing in the future. What can you do to help us make up for that?
The process of appropriations is going to change in any way, shape, and form. And especially if Boehner becomes the Speaker, he is guaranteed there will be a process of doing it. The Congress does have the constitutional responsibility of determining what is funded. So there is no one back there that wants to turn over to the administration to say, just because the administration put something in their preferred budget, that is what should be funded. But the process will be different. What you define as an earmark probably can change. But in the past, there have been abuses of the system. So if indeed you have the possibility, it happened more on the Senate than on the House, of somebody going on the floor and just, we call it airdropping, dropping an appropriated item for a specific entity into the budget without any kind of review or process of that, that's wrong. So there needed to be some kind of reform. I don't think anyone will use the word earmark again because it is simply too toxic. But Congress still will be directing funding to specific programs, but I think what they want to do is make sure that there are barriers to provide both transparency and accountability at the same time. So those ideas of airdrop earmarks and the abuse of the system, which did happen, will change. Look, when earmarks was the process, I wanted to make sure I worked it. I did not want my constituents to be put at a disadvantage. I don't think we were. But I also want you to know that most of the so-called earmarks that I got were for the military. And as an example, the military, you can't just put in an earmark for the military. Anything you want to do as a plus-up or an add-on for military, whether you ask for it or not, has to be approved first by the military. It has to be part of their 5- and their 10-year plan for the military, and has to be reviewed by a committee. Otherwise, our committee simply would not put anything in a bill that hadn't been checked off by the Air Force or the Army. That's the kind of process I want to go through, so that any kind of spending goes to a specific area, has to go through some various checks to make sure other people are looking at it, and it's not simply shoved through without anyone actually seeing what's going on. So I want to end the abuses of the system. And that, I think, is going to happen. Regardless of how the election outcome, that's going to happen. So it's going to be a different way of doing the funding, and I think it's going to be a better way in the long term of doing the funding. This last year, House Republicans took the pledge not to send any earmarks into the budget. That does not mean that there wasn't spending that went to our districts. It simply means we did use the so-called earmark process. We tried to make it much more transparent. I'm thinking, regardless of what happens, that will probably be the wave of the future in both houses of Congress. So there will still be money coming to Utah State, but hopefully it will be money that has been reviewed by several different entities and several different pairs of eyes, and I think that's appropriate. Okay.
Boehner and other Republicans released Pledge to America recently, and it kind of seems as if some Congress members are trying to tie themselves to that, and others are trying to distance themselves from it. I was wondering what your views on it are.
I'm tied to it because you've got about 3 of my ideas that are part of it. So I like it, obviously. You have to realize the Pledge to America is not the contract to America. It is not even the roadmap for the future. What the pledge is different. These are things that Republicans have for bills and ideas that we are prepared to drop today and debate today. It is not necessarily what will be the future. It is the foundation of stuff that is to come. But anything that was in that pledge is stuff that we are prepared right now to go forward with. For example, when I talked about border security, one of my bills, 5016, is specifically mentioned in that. We are prepared today to move forward on that particular issue, and that does not preclude what may happen later on. So it's different. It's not the roadmap. It's not what we're going to do in the future. It is specifically what we're ready to do right now, if we were given the opportunity to introduce those bills.
I'm about to graduate in secondary education, and so the public schools are very important to me. I want to know if you're willing to, what are your ideas on how to create more funds for these big budget cuts that are facing our public school systems here in Utah?
First of all, don't come back to us because we will screw it up. I'm sorry. There's no other way. The federal government will screw it up. So let me give you some specific examples of how we screw things up. The alleged economic stimulus for education that was recently passed was a partisan ploy. It was $50 billion, and there is no money for it. So by law, by rule of the House and Senate, we have to be able to pay for all those programs. So the pay for those $50 billion was closing a loophole that was already used on 4 other programs that was paid for already. So the $50 billion was simply money we're sending to the states that was cranked out by turning the printing press. There's nothing behind it. Any district that takes that money better not put it in the base. They better use it for one-time procedures, because it's not going to be replicated. So that's what we do. And then, what is even cooler is because the federal government really doesn't know how to distribute money fairly, we make the assumption that if you're poor, you need much more money, so all monies are going to be appropriated based on the number of Title I schools you have and the Medicare procedures that you have. So for example, if indeed that $50 billion was spread out on a head count, for every dollar a kid in Utah would get for their education, somebody in New York would get $1.50, $1.80, somewhere around there, because they have more Title I schools. The committee at one time wanted to reauthorize No Child Left Behind, and I made the mistake of actually reading the bill. It was not stimulating reading. And unfortunately, because I'm an old school teacher, I understand some of the words, which was even worse. So for example, I went to them and I said, you have in this bill a plan for a career ladder program for Title I schools. Having lived in Utah, I have seen career ladders and hated them. And so what is your goal? What are you trying to do with career ladders? What is the purpose of that? And the staff simply said, actually, we don't know, but it sounded good and NEA liked it. Don't trust the federal government to try and solve the problem. If indeed you want to actually fund education, both on the secondary level as well as the university level, you've got to build the base economy of this state to do it. You're not going to do it by any kind of grants coming from Washington. And I hate to say that, but you understand that. In this state, you need to expand the 2 areas of this economy which have not been expanded, and that is manufacturing and mining. If, for example, you went to Wyoming to start as a teacher, you would get 20 grand a year more to start, and on every lane you get 20 grand a year more than you would in Montana, because Wyoming develops their resources. Montana does not develop their resources. Utah needs to develop its resources. So when Secretary Salazar put those 77 leases off the table, and he did it illegally, that put a huge hole in the amount of money that this state can have to fund education. You really want to do that? Make sure those leases are established and developed. That's the only way you're going to fund education in Utah. And I want it funded because I'm on state retirement. I want the retirement system funded.